Hi. Well, here I am in my home in Plattsmouth, Nebraska on Beaver Lake. Behind me, I have some of the banners that we developed with the League of Women Voters this year, but they're at my house because we're home. And so what I'm going to be talking about tonight is an abbreviated presentation that I developed on the women's suffrage movement, focusing on Nebraska, but within a framework of the national movement. And I'm going to share a PowerPoint, which I'm going to do now. Let's see, share screen. So bear with me a little bit here. Share. And share slides, slideshow. Okay, so there should be the technical things, and I'm going to appear in a little box, and I can see Chris now, but I don't know if he can see me. But anyway, I'll be talking about the long road to women's suffrage in Nebraska, which, as Chris said, culminated with the ratification of the 19th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, giving women the right to vote. And this is the 100th anniversary of that amendment. So before we kind of talk about the bits and pieces about the suffrage movement, both nationally and especially in Nebraska, there's, I think, some things that are really important to remember. And one is that the women's suffrage campaign in the United States was very long, 72 years, in fact. And it was actually 64 years in the state of Nebraska. And Nebraskans had the opportunity to be the first territory or state that would have women's suffrage, but it failed on those attempts. And there was actually 3 amendments that went to the voters of the state, the male voters of the state, and they were all turned down. The suffrage movement also included 3 generations. The first generation came out of the abolition movement, and it included such famous suffragists as Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucretia Mott, Susan B. Anthony, and Frederick Douglass. Those suffrage leaders were not alive when the suffrage amendment finally passed in 1920. The middle group of suffragists is where Carrie Chapman Catt fits in. As Chris said, I directed the Carrie Chapman Catt Center for Women in Politics at Iowa State for 22 years. Carrie was an Iowa State grad, and so very proud of her work in the state of Iowa. But she served as president twice of the National American Women's Suffrage Association, including that key time from 1915 to 1920 with the final campaign. Then the last generation of suffragists were the younger, more militant women. Carrie Chapman Catt was considered more moderate. She worked with both political parties. The more militant women were fairly anti-Democrat because it was the Democrats that opposed suffrage at that time. So they protested at the White House. Alice Paul, again, probably the most famous one, but there is also a woman from Omaha, born and raised in Omaha, Doris Stevens, who was also part of those silent sentinels that protested at the White House and were jailed. Suffrage also was not just the national campaigns. There were state campaigns in almost every state, including Nebraska. There were suffrage associations that later became leagues of women voters. And there was also a lot of local campaigns. Of course, over these 72 years, tens of thousands of volunteers were involved with the movement, not only women from many walks of life, but of course, men were involved as well, because to gain suffrage, the men of the state had to approve it, or the legislature, or ultimately Congress. And there were also a lot of anti-suffrage organizations, including in Nebraska, and typically these were led by women. And by the end of the campaign, millions of dollars was spent on women gaining the right to vote. So historians agree that the women's suffrage movement started in Seneca Falls, New York. They had a women's rights convention there. It was organized by Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. 200 people attended. It was women only the first day, and then men were allowed the second day. About 200 women participated and 40 men, including Frederick Douglass, the renowned abolitionist and former slave. They passed 11 resolutions. And I'm going to move this, I think they passed 11 resolutions, and the most controversial resolution turned out to be achieving women's sacred right to elective franchise. They thought that was way too radical. And so it was actually Frederick Douglass that gave a very passionate speech saying that you need to approve this as one of your resolutions, and it was. The suffrage movement in Nebraska really dates back to 1855, just 7 years after the national movement began. Amelia Bloomer came to Omaha to speak in 1855. She was an Iowa suffrage leader living in Council Bluffs, came over the river, talked in Omaha in front of Douglass House, and her speech was so inspirational that people that heard it suggested to the territorial legislature that they should invite her to speak. So they did just that. She spoke on January 8th of 1856, and on January 25th, the House in the territorial legislature passed a women's suffrage resolution, but the session ended without a vote in the upper house. In 1867, Nebraska actually became the second state in the nation following Kansas to approve what we call as school suffrage. And that was to allow inhabitants 21 years of age and older to vote in school district elections. It took effect in 1869, but then it was amended in 1875 just to include male citizens and unmarried women, which seems a little counterintuitive that married women with children would not be voting on school issues. But it was extended again in 1881 to women with school-aged children. So the very first vote to the voters, told you earlier, Nebraska male voters had 3 chances to approve women's suffrage in Nebraska. The first one came in 1871 when delegates gathered to write a constitution for the new state. They wrote a constitution that included a proposal for women's suffrage as an amendment. The whole constitution was turned down by voters, but the amendment that got the least support, only 22% of the vote, was a women's suffrage proposal. So here the delegates convene again 4 years later to write another state constitution. And this time they thought, we're not going to include women's suffrage in this constitution. Not only are we not going to include it, we're going to deny voting rights to criminals, the mentally ill, and to women. And that was approved by the male voters of the state. So around that time, national suffrage leaders still saw Nebraska as an opportunity to become the first state in the nation that would grant women's suffrage. Now, I should mention in 1869, the women's suffrage movement split into 2 organizations, the American Women's Suffrage Association and the National Women's Suffrage Association, over disagreements over support for the 14th and especially 15th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, giving voting rights to African-American men, but not to women. So Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton were in the National Women's Suffrage Association. And although they were focusing on a federal constitutional amendment, they did some state suffrage work, and they did come to Nebraska in 1877. Susan B. Anthony speaks in Hebron and Beatrice, and then in 1879, Elizabeth Cady Stanton visits Hebron, and she also helped organize the Thayer County Women's Suffrage Association, the first local suffrage association in the state. 2 other prominent suffrage leaders in Nebraska were Erasmus and Lucy Carell. They were the editors of the pro-suffrage Hebron Journal. And in 1880, Erasmus was elected to the legislature. So he had a resolution that basically removed male from the state constitution, and the legislature passed the resolution to send that to the voters. So that same year, the Nebraska Women's Suffrage Association was founded to help promote that resolution with voters of the state, and the vote was to come up in 1882. So that's when there was a very intense campaign for women's suffrage in Nebraska. The National Women's Suffrage Association, the American Women's Suffrage Association, held their national conventions in Omaha. But in that fall, Nebraska male voters rejected for the second time the suffrage amendment. Another suffrage leader in Nebraska is Clara B Colby of Beatrice. She began publishing the Women's Journal in 1883. Now, this was actually a national journal, and it was published for 26 years, later headquartered in Washington, D.C. Clara also served as president of the Nebraska Women's Suffrage Association in 1885 and to 1898. Now, as Chris said earlier, we were going to be at Jocelyn Castle tonight and did some reading on Sarah Jocelyn and found out that she was also involved in the suffrage movement. She was a great philanthropist, she and her husband, and she gave to a lot of community causes, but she supported with their money pro-suffrage candidates for political office. And in 1888, she attended a convention of the Nebraska Women's Suffrage Association and was appointed to a state suffrage committee on resolutions. Another suffrage leader around this time, and she worked not only on suffrage, but on other community activities in Omaha, was Jessie Hale Moss. She was a social worker who helped establish the Negro Women's Christian Association in Omaha. That organization focused a lot on social activities and educational events and community building for African-American neighborhoods in Omaha, but they also supported women's voting rights and campaigned for that within the African-American community. So back on the national level, the U.S. Women's Suffrage Campaign basically merged and came together in 1890. They were not very successful working on their own from 1869 to 1890. No state or territory approved women's suffrage in that time. So they joined together and became the National American Women's Suffrage Association. And they decided first that they would focus on state suffrage. And they got their first win in 1890 when Wyoming was admitted to the Union with a state constitution granting women's suffrage. And that was closely followed by other Western states, Colorado in 1893, Utah and Idaho in 1896, and then in 1910, Washington state granted women's suffrage. In 1915, Carrie Chapman Catt was elected to her second term as president of the National American Women's Suffrage Association. And she gave a speech in 1916 where she revealed her winning plan, focusing on a federal constitutional amendment, which was financed by a bequest that she got in a will of a prominent woman New York City publisher that today would be valued at $25 million. 1917, Doris Stevens, who I mentioned earlier, she was born in Omaha, grew up in Omaha, later went to college in Ohio and settled to New York City. She was jailed in 1917 along with Alice Paul and other silent sentinels for their protests at the White House. Doris later wrote a book called Jailed for Freedom, which was published in 1920. Back in Nebraska, we have our third attempt to have a women's suffrage amendment in the state. And they actually had a campaign that was called Nebraska Next, because it wasn't first, but Nebraska might be next. In 1914, a suffrage resolution barely was defeated in the legislature. So the Women's Suffrage Associations got together, collected, I think it was about 48,000 signatures to place a petition on the ballot in 1914. And it was very narrowly defeated that year by about a 51 to 49% margin. So certainly support for suffrage was a growing tide in Nebraska. In 1917, a limited suffrage bill passed the legislature with the support of pro-suffrage Governor Keith Neville. And that resolution gave women the right to vote in city elections and for presidential electors. There were anti-suffrage efforts to put the referendum on the ballot for the 1918 election, but suffrage leaders found out that many of the signatures were fraudulent, and so that was thrown out. It eventually went to the Nebraska Supreme Court. They supported the suffrage advocates against the anti-suffrage forces, and Nebraska women could vote in 1919, not only in school district elections, but in local elections. And that first election was held in Geneva, and more women than men cast their votes approving a sewage bond. Now, a point of a personal history is that Morrell Keith Neville, the pro-suffrage governor, is the grandfather of my husband, Keith Neville Bystrom. Okay, so now on the national level, the tide is turning nationally as well. The Susan B. Anthony Amendment, as it was known, had been introduced in the US Congress for 42 years with exactly the same language that it was approved in 1920. It actually, some years it never got out of committee, some years it would get out of committee. In 1918, the House voted to approve it, but it failed in the Senate. Woodrow Wilson supported the amendment by 1918, but in 1990, the House approved the amendment on May 21st, and the Senate quickly confirmed on June 4th. So then it goes to the state. So the ratification process is that 3/4 of the state need to approve an amendment before it's added to the Constitution. There were 48 states in 1920, so that meant there had to be 36 states that voted. You can see by here, we're not going through all of this, but that ratification process started on June 10th, and you have a lot of states jumping on board in those early months. Nebraska was the 14th state to ratify the 19th Amendment on August 2nd, 1919. So you get down to March and you have West Virginia and Washington, and then you're stuck with 35 states. And who's going to be the 36 states? There were some legislatures that weren't even convened in 1920 and others that said, we're not going to take this up. But Tennessee was a state that agreed to take it up. It was a state that's a southern state, but there was an active pro-suffrage campaign, but also a very active anti-suffrage campaign. But that looked like the best bet. So the suffrage leaders, Carrie Chapman Catt, moved down there to a hotel. Efforts were there all summer. And there's lots of interesting stories out of Tennessee, but one of my favorites involves Harry T. Byrne. He was 24 years old, the youngest member of the Congress, or the legislature. He was in the House of Representatives from Eastern Tennessee. He had planned to vote against the amendment because he was told by his party that that's what his constituents would want. But on the day of the vote, where suffrage leaders thought this is going to fail by one vote, Harry had a telegram from his mother. And that telegram read in part, Harry, be a good boy. Help Mrs. Catt put the rat in ratification. And the amendment passed by one vote. And I think also that underscores the importance of voting, and that one vote does matter. So women's voting rights became the suffrage amendment was ratified on August 26, 1920. That's still, it's celebrated today as Women's Equality Day. That celebration is taking place place every year since the 1970s. There were great celebrations across the United States. Carrie Chapman Catt, who's pictured here on the cover of Time magazine, gave a speech in New York City. And it's a very eloquent speech, and in part reads about the vote being the emblem of these women's equality, the guarantee of their liberty. She talked about all the agony that women's suffrage leaders had suffered over the years so that not only the woman there could vote, but their daughters were going to be able to vote as well. The vote has been costly, and prize it. And the speech ends with progress is calling on you to make no pause, act. Carrie Chapman Catt devoted 33 years of her life to the suffrage movement. She founded the League of Women Voters on February 14, 1920, before the amendment was ratified, because she knew that, that this was not the end of the campaign, that women needed to be educated and encouraged to vote. The 19th Amendment enfranchised 27 million women 3 months before the presidential election. According to a New York Times article, they said 10 million women voted. So that would be about 1/3 of the women voters. So there was some disappointment there, but Carrie Chapman Catt reminded them that they were new voters and that work would continue. From 1924 to 1965, there were court decisions, congressional actions, and other efforts to extend the right to vote to men and women of color. And so by 1964, more women than men have voted in every general election, both in terms of numbers and also in terms of percentages. In 2016, for example, 74 million women voted compared to 64 million men, a difference of 10 million. So that difference was 10 million in 2016, when only 10 million women voted in 1920. That's the end of my presentation.